Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to attend this event. We have a most distinguished guest speaker today, and I will introduce Professor Kishore Mahbubani shortly. My name is Cheng Huan, and I'll be your moderator today. I was born in Tolak Intan in Malaysia, but I've lived in Hong Kong for more than 40 years. First of all, I would like to thank our joint organizers, May Jam and Sing Jam, especially Datuk Ngan, Chairman of May Jam, and Basil Huang, Vice Chairman of Sing Jam, for making this event possible. They extend their greetings to members of both May Jam and Sing Jam, and for those who are not yet members of these two great chambers, I do hope you sign up as members. We also like to thank Dr. Lawrence Liu, Deputy Chairman of May Jam, and Ms. Helen Deal, Executive Director of Sing Jam, for the hard work in organizing today's event. Professor Kishore will speak on the topic of what impact will the increased tensions in US-China relations have on our region. To many of us, the US-China relations are now at an inflection point amid the COVID-19 crisis. The crisis has increased bilateral tensions associated with a trade war, mutual recriminations about the spread of COVID-19 have made it much harder for the two powers to cooperate in combating this global pandemic. How will this mixture of threats stemming from the pandemic as well as the geopolitical competition impact on the security and prosperity of Asia and beyond? Professor Kishore hardly needs any introduction. Recently, on May the 13th to be precise, he gave a talk to our Hong Kong Foundation, a think tank established by our former chief executive, Mr. Tung Chee Hwa. On that occasion, Mr. Tung gave a very glowing tribute to Professor Kishore. Recently, I asked a friend in England if he had heard of Professor Kishore, and he promptly replied, "Oh, he is a legend." Professor Kishore was born in Singapore and has given exemplary services to the island state. He was Singapore's ambassador to the United Nations and was the president of the United Nations Security Council. He was dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. The professor has also written at least 8 books covering important topics, especially the US-China relations. He has also written on Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and ASEAN. When the Foreign Policy Association Medal was awarded to him in New York, he was described as, and I quote, "a gifted diplomat, a student of history and philosophy, a provocative writer, and an intuitive thinker," unquote. We have only about 45 minutes to listen to this wise man. There are many diplomats here who are patiently waiting to listen to him to talk about the relationship between the richest and most powerful country and the world's second largest country. China has regained Hong Kong's sovereignty, but other countries in this part of the world live under China's mighty shadow. Very quickly, after Professor Kishore's speech, there are a number of questions I've been provided for by the participants to ask Professor. But now over to Professor Kishore. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cheng Huan, for that very generous introduction. I fear that you have raised expectations too high, and now I suspect everyone listening will be disappointed, but I'm really happy to join both the Malaysian Chamber of Commerce and the Singapore Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. And as you know, I said at that session with Mr. C.H. Tung on May 13, I love Hong Kong. I miss Hong Kong, and I wish as soon as this Hong Kong-Singapore travel bubble starts, I'll be among the first to come to Hong Kong. And I hope that next time we will all be able to meet in person and not virtually. I'm also very happy to discuss the topic you suggest about the impact of the US-China geopolitical contest on us, especially in the region. But before getting there, I want to, in a sense, firstly set the stage to explain why the world looks very confusing. And indeed, the reason why it's quite natural for all of us living in the year 2021 to feel confused about the world, the reason why we should feel confused is because there are not just one, there are at least three major structural changes taking place at the same time for humanity. And so adjusting to any one of them would take a lot of effort. Adjusting to three structural changes at the same time is a huge challenge for humanity. And I think it's important for us to understand all three, because when future historians look back at our time, this is what they will see. They will see these three big shifts. The first major shift that is happening is, of course, it's what I call the end of the era of Western domination of world history. And in some ways, actually, it's people in Hong Kong can understand this, because Hong Kong actually, I think, was sort of colonized around 1842, 1843. And now it's gone back to China. But Hong Kong was very much, in some ways, the reason why it could survive as a British colony for so long was because Hong Kong was in many ways a symbol of the era of Western domination of world history. And of course, this was the era when the big shift that happened, by the way, just to emphasize this, is that from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. So it's only in the last 200 years that Europe has taken off and North America has taken off. So the past 200 years of world history have therefore been a major historical aberration. And that aberration is coming to an end. But even though it's coming to an end, it's very difficult for the West to adjust to this. And the reluctance of the West to, in a sense, restructure the world, to accept the fact it can no longer dominate the world, is one of the reasons why we are having lots of challenges in the world. And people say, what do you mean by adjusting to this new world? I said, I'll give you one example. The most dynamic economies in the world today are clearly those in East Asia. The fastest growing economy in the world over the last 40 years has been China. And yet, if you look at the two largest global international economic organizations, the IMF and the World Bank, which were set up in the late 1940s, even to today, you have a rule that says that to become the head of the IMF, you must be European, and to become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. So 4 billion Asians don't qualify to run the IMF and the World Bank, even though their economies are now much more dynamic and vibrant. But the sheer refusal of the West to adjust and accept a world that it no longer dominates is therefore one structural issue that the world is dealing with. And that's a challenge in its own right. That's one structural challenge, number one. The structural challenge number two is the fact that the world is shrinking enormously, rapidly, and essentially all of humanity is becoming one. I think, you know, again, when future historians look at our time, they will say the two major challenges that humanity face, in a sense, as a common human species, were climate change and COVID-19. And these two major challenges are again sending a signal of a major structural shift in history. And what is this major structural shift in history? To capture it, I use a simple boat metaphor. And I say, before the modern era, contemporary era of globalization, when 7.5 billion people live in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats, with captains and crews taking care of each boat. And I emphasize they were on separate boats because if COVID-19 had hit one boat in the past, it would not have traveled to the other boat because they were people on separate boats. But what's happened is that as a result of rapid globalization, the world has shrunk, it's become small and interdependent and interconnected. And so the 7.5 billion people no longer live in 193 separate boats. They live on 193 separate cabins on the same boat. Now, it's very important to hoist in this metaphor because it explains for a start why, for example, COVID-19 could spread to almost every country in the world within a few months, because all of us are on the same boat. But the problem with our global boat is that we have captains and crews taking care of each cabin, but no one taking care of the global boat as a whole. And logically, if we represented the most intelligent species, we shouldn't just be taking care of our own cabins or our own countries. We should be taking care of the global boat as a whole. And therefore, we should be strengthening institutions of global governance. Let me just introduce a very important connection between the structural challenge number one that I mentioned, end of Western domination, and structural challenge number two, which is the shrinking of our world and us living in one boat now. See, what the West, when I mentioned, I gave you the examples of IMF and the World Bank for a deliberate reason. The West still wants to either control global institutions or weaken them, because they're seen as a threat to Western power, right? That's why the West has weakened the United Nations, weakened organizations like the World Health Organization, right? But then if you look at structural challenge number two, we should be strengthening institutions of global governance, like the World Health Organization, right? Logically, that's what we should be doing. And you ask yourself, why isn't it happening? Why isn't it happening? It isn't happening because the West doesn't want to adjust to a world where it is dominant. And I illustrate this with a concrete point relating to the World Health Organization. In the 1970s, about 72% of the budget of the World Health Organization came from compulsory contributions, and only 28% came from voluntary contributions. The West didn't like that. They couldn't control compulsory contributions. They could control voluntary contributions. So over the years, the West has used its power to reduce the compulsory contributions to the World Health Organization down to 18%. 18%. And this obviously weakens the World Health Organization, because the World Health Organization cannot recruit long-term health inspectors, long-term scientific expertise on the basis of voluntary contributions, which make up the majority they can't do it, right? So you can see, logically, you should increase the amount of compulsory contributions to the World Health Organization, but the West will resist it. See, you can see how, therefore, structural contradiction number one, right, where the West has got to deal with the loss of power, structural contradiction number two, where we have to strengthen global institutions, are therefore related. So handling these two contradictions alone will be a challenge for the world. Now there's a third big one that has exploded over the last 10 years, which is we're going to see the transition of the number one power in the world. The number one power in the world for the last 130 years or so has clearly been the United States. And for a start, one measurement of that, of course, is that the US has the world's largest GNP. But sometime within the next 10 years or so, probably in all probability, China will have the largest GNP and United States will become number two. And one thing we know from like 2,000 or 3,000 years of human history, no number one power gives up its number one status easily. It will fight against it. And that's why the United States has decided to launch this geopolitical contest against China. And so this is another third structural challenge that the world is dealing with at the same time as we're dealing with the first two structural challenges, and they're all related. So for example, when COVID-19 broke out in 2020, right? One of the oldest rules of geopolitics is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So when COVID-19 emerged as an enemy of China and COVID-19 emerged as an enemy of the United States of America, logically, if indeed United States and China wanted to defend their own interests, they should have said, hey, let's set aside our geopolitical differences. Let's focus and work together in fighting COVID-19. But as you know, that didn't happen. Indeed, under Trump, he tried to use COVID-19 to weaken China rather than cooperating with China to deal with a common enemy. And the fact that he did that showed how this US-China geopolitical contest is also driven by deep structural forces. Now, I understand many of you, as I was discussing earlier with the organizers, many of you have already read my book, Has China Won? So you know what these structural forces are, but I'll just mention them, summarize them briefly, so you know what I'm referring to. The first structural force, of course, that's driving this contest is what I've already referred to, which is the world's number one power never gracefully gives up power to the world's number one emerging power. So when the United States tries to push down China, that's perfectly normal behavior for any great power to do. But at the same time, what makes the US-China contest very different is that there are two other structural forces driving it. The first one everyone knows and talks about, but the second one, no one talks about. This is, of course, the fear of the yellow peril. And, I want to emphasize that the fear of the yellow peril has been present in the Western imagination ever since the Mongols almost invaded Europe for 800-900 years. So it's a real thing, but it surfaces from time to time. And in the case of the United States, by the way, it surfaced even as far back as 130 years ago, when at the end of the 19th century, the US Congress the US Congress passed the Chinese Racial Exclusion Act. I mean, if that's not a powerful indicator of the yellow peril, I don't know what is. And as you know, sadly, the yellow peril is now also surfacing not just in anti-China rhetoric and actions in the United States, it's also surfacing in anti-Chinese rhetoric and actions, and that's very dangerous. But to be fair, I would say Joe Biden and his administration, unlike President Trump, is handling that issue differently and trying to fight prejudice against Chinese, and we should praise Joe Biden for doing that. But at the same time, having mentioned Biden, I also want to mention that what makes this US-China geopolitical contest unusual is that the United States is divided now, as we know, on everything except when it comes to China. There's a bipartisan consensus to stand up to China. And this is a result of the fact that many Americans believe that as United States engage China, China would open up economically. After China opens up economically, China would open up politically. China would become a liberal democracy, and US and China could live happily ever after. Now that sounds like a dream, but that's what many people believe. And it's also documented in articles written by people like Kurt Campbell and elsewhere in Foreign Affairs. So you can, I mentioned these structural forces because it shows you that this is a real contest that is carrying on. And the sheer fact that the US-China geopolitical contest carried on, despite the fact they should cooperate on COVID-19, indicates how it's driven very deeply and powerfully. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, you have now 3 structural challenges to deal with. But the one that's driving it clearly is the US-China geopolitical contest. And I can assure you that countries all around the world are now figuring out how to deal with it. And I'll be addressing, of course, now how especially the Asian countries are reacting to this challenge. But before doing so, I just want to briefly discuss one subject, which is funny, and I want to discuss it because the Americans never discuss it. What is the subject? Now, of course, when a new contest breaks out between 2 great powers, the first question to ask is, who will win, right? That's a logical question to ask. And in the United States, it is impossible for any politician to even suggest that the United States could lose this contest. And the most Americans are very confident that US will win this contest against China because they say, oh, we've done it before. The US is a dynamic democracy. It fought off a major challenge against the Soviet Union, which was run by a communist party. Since the United States triumphed against the previous strong communist party of Soviet Union, the United States will, of course, triumph against the Communist Party of China. So it's like it's sort of built in as a rock solid conviction in American minds. But yet, you know, the one thing that I tried to contribute in trying to help Americans understand this US-China contest is to tell them, yes, maybe if it's a democracy versus Communist Party system, the US is likely to win. But if you dig deep down, and I devote a whole chapter of this in my book to this subject, the US democracy has become a plutocracy. What is a plutocracy? Now, a democracy is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. A plutocracy is a government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. Now, this sounds like an exaggeration to many of you, but I want to emphasize that very eminent Western figures like the late Paul Volcker, the head of the Fed, like Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel laureate, like Martin Wolf, the Financial Times, have also described the US as a plutocracy. And the US is also the world's only major developed country where the average income of the bottom 50% has gone down over 30 years, indicating that wealth is being transferred to the top 1%, while the bottom 50% are suffering. And by contrast, China today, in exact opposite to the Soviet Union, is today a meritocracy. And what is a meritocracy? A meritocracy is a government where you select the very best to go and work in the government. So the net result of all that is that the quality of mind in the Chinese government is among the best in the world today. China is outperforming every society. And at the same time, China has also done more to improve the well-being of the Chinese people than any other Chinese government has in 4,000 years of Chinese history. So you can see on the one side, you have United States underperforming and China relatively overperforming. So I would think the logical thing to worry about is for an American to ask, can I lose? But it's impossible to ask that question. And this brings me to the third part of what I'm going to talk about, which is the impact on our region and on the rest of the world, because the rest of the world clearly sees more clearly than the United States does, than what most Americans see, that it is not going to be so easy for the United States to defeat China. And certainly most countries in the world now acknowledge the reality that China's economy will become number one in the next 10 years. And when that happens, everything changes clearly. And that's why you notice there are many significant differences this time around between how the United States performed or did in the Cold War against the Soviet Union and how it is doing vis-a-vis China. There are many significant differences. First one, in the Cold War between United States and Soviet Union, the United States enjoyed the enthusiastic support of many of its closest friends and allies. So for example, the European states were very enthusiastic about supporting United States against the Soviet Union because their interests were completely aligned. I mean, the Soviet Union was in fact a far greater threat to Europe than it was to the United States. So it made perfect sense for the European countries to work closely with the United States against the Soviet Union. Logical, rational behavior. But it wasn't just the European states. It was also many major third world states, including, for example, in Southeast Asia, Indonesia was aligned with the United States. In the Cold War, Pakistan was allied with the United States. In the Cold War, Egypt was aligned with the United States in the Cold War. You can see how the United States managed to build together a formidable global coalition in an effort to contain China. But you see that if the United States tries to assemble such a global coalition against China in the same way they did against the Soviet Union, it will fail. And one reason it will fail is that the Chinese actually, in some ways, anticipated the fact that the day would come when the United States would try to mount a similar containment strategy against China. And this, by the way, the fact that the Chinese anticipated this 10, 20 years ago reflects a critical point about the US-China contest that actually I haven't touched upon, which is of course mentioned in my book, which is that in this contest between US and China, while China clearly has a long-term consistent strategy on how to manage the United States does not have a consistent long-term strategy for managing China. And for those of you who have read my book, you will see that I refer to it in chapter 1 of my book. I refer to a one-on-one lunch I had with Henry Kissinger, where he told me that the United States doesn't have a strategy to deal with China. And so that's why the United States is having lots of challenges dealing with China, because for a start, almost no country in the world is enthusiastically joining the United States. In fact, for most countries in the world, because the Chinese have been, in a sense, sharing their prosperity with so many countries in the world, many of them have too much to lose if they go against China. So even recently, even though there have been challenges within China and the European states, which you must have read about, nonetheless, for most European states, their number one trading partner used to be the United States. For many of them now, the number one trading partner is China. And certainly if you come to East Asia, without exception, for almost all East Asian states, the number one trading partner is China. And of course, Exhibit A in all this is the ASEAN region. And I can tell you that one of the most brilliant steps that China took way back over 20 years ago was to propose a free trade agreement with the 10 ASEAN countries. And China didn't just propose a free trade agreement, it allowed early harvest of making unilateral concessions to the ASEAN countries. And that completely changed the relations between ASEAN and China. Just to illustrate that, in the year 2000, around the time when China proposed the free trade agreement with ASEAN, China's trade with ASEAN was about $40 billion, I think, and United States was $130 billion. So United States trade with ASEAN was 3 times China's trade with ASEAN. But amazingly, as a result of the free trade agreement and other agreements that have been signed, China's trade with ASEAN is now double American trade with ASEAN. It's about $1 trillion compared to $500 billion for the United States. You can see how trade within ASEAN and China has exploded. And let me, just to illustrate how remarkable this trade is, everyone, when you ask anyone, which country or region would be the #1 trading partner for China, some people might say the European Union, or some people might say the United States. Actually, both answers are wrong. The #1 trading partner for China today are the 10 ASEAN countries. And so for the 10 ASEAN countries, clearly, there is no enthusiasm whatsoever to join this containment strategy against China if the United States wants to launch one against China. And I'm glad I'm speaking to you today, because just this morning, about 6 hours ago, the one thing I do, by the way, at the National University of Singapore, I'm the coordinator of the Asian Peace Program. Please Google Asian Peace Program at the National University of Singapore. 6 hours ago, we put an article on our website written by the former Indonesian ambassador to the United States of America. I emphasize former Indonesian ambassador to the United States of America. He served in the United States. He's a friend of the United States. He's not an enemy of the United States. His name is Dino Jalal. Please, it's a short article. It's a 1,100 word article. Read that article. It's very significant article. He says very categorically, yes, we want to maintain good ties with the United States, but don't ask us to choose between China and the United States. We want to have good ties with the United States, but we also want to have good ties with China. And he says, not one country in Southeast Asia agrees with the United States in saying that China is an ideological foe. It is not an ideological foe. And then Indonesia, as you know, is the world's most populous country, most populous Islamic country in the world, right? #1 in terms of population. And what does he say in the article? He says none of the Islamic countries, including Indonesia, share the agenda of the United States on Xinjiang, right? This is the Muslim country saying this. So reason I emphasize that article, because Indonesia, at the end of the day, is the most populous country in Southeast Asia, the most populous Islamic country, and as I mentioned earlier, a very close ally of the United States in the Cold War against China. And today, Indonesia is saying, no, we want to be good friends with the United States, we want to be good friends with China. And it makes sense because at the end of the day, and this is what some Indonesians told me privately, they said that when American officials come to United States, they only have one message. They say, oh, Indonesia, you must stand with us against the aggressive China, right? They say that very strongly. But he said, the Indonesians tell me, but the Americans bring nothing to the table, nothing, except stand up to China. By contrast, when the Chinese leaders come, they say, okay, how can we help you? Can we help you build a railway? And now, as you know, the railway within Jakarta and Bandung is being built by with the help of China? Can we help you build a highway? Can we help you build a port? And more recently in COVID-19, as you know, sadly, maybe because the United States had its own challenges, the United States allowed export of zero COVID-19 vaccines, but Indonesia has received 160 million doses of vaccine. And out of the 160 million, I think 120 million came from China. And even the president of Indonesia, President Joko Widodo, got his vaccination from a Chinese vaccine. Now that's a very powerful statement, you know. So you can see, this is the point I'm getting at, that when the United States comes to the region and keeps saying, you must stand with us against China, no country is enthusiastic about it because they all have other issues to do with China. Now, I'm going to deal very briefly with a group of 3 countries who have joined the United States in something called the Quad. The Quad, of course, is United States, Japan, Australia, India. Now, let me emphasize this. If you ask these 4 countries, is the Quad an anti-China alliance? They will deny it. Absolutely deny it. And if you say that the Quad is a mini NATO, they'll also deny it. And by the way, incidentally, I wrote an article on the Quad. You can read it on the website of the Foreign Policy magazine, in which I pointed out that the Quad is something that at the end of the day is going to have difficulty gaining traction because the interests of the countries varies a great deal. So for example, even though Japan and Australia are clearly very staunch allies of the United States, there's no doubt whatsoever that they're allies of the United States, but their number 1 trading partner is China. So it'll be very difficult for Australia and Japan to go all out and cut off their trade ties with China. So, and you notice that even though one of the first things that President Joe Biden did was to convene a meeting of the Quad at the leaders level, they didn't discuss defense cooperation. Instead, they said, oh, the Quad will work together to provide vaccines to Southeast Asia, right? And they promised $1 billion doses of vaccine to Southeast Asia. And that was a good thing. Frankly, it was a very positive development that the Quad promised 1 billion doses of vaccine, I think 2 or 3 months ago. So far, how many have come? 0. Why? I mean, it's sad. It's sad that India itself has had a major outbreak, and now India, quite understandably, wants to take care of its own population. The United States is taking care of its own population. Japan is struggling with issues of COVID-19. So there has been no export. So the Quad is something that is spoken about a lot, and we can discuss it more in the Q&A, but I don't see it as a formidable or a powerful anti-China alliance that will work because very few countries want to join it in the Quad. And even like, to give you an example, South Korea is another major ally of the United States in East Asia. Logically, since Australia, Japan have joined, South Korea should also join. Then they can change the name of the from Quad to Squad. South Korea as a member of the Quad too. But it's unlikely that South Korea will join. The reasons are complicated. I mean, South Korea's main preoccupation is North Korea. And there's no way that South Korea can solve the problem of North Korea without working with China. So it'd be absolutely unwise for South Korea to join this kind of alliance. So with all these examples, what I'm trying to convey to you very, very simply is a reality that most people in Washington, D.C. do not understand. Many people in Washington, D.C. continue to believe that doesn't matter what, in one way or another, the countries will all line up with the United States against China. And my message to you very clearly is that the evidence so far shows that even though many countries in the world do have reservations about China, do have concerns about China, do have concerns about some of China's assertive behavior, none of them are going to join a sort of a solid anti-China alliance in the way that the Americans anticipated. So that, of course, the bottom line of all this is that with all the countries in the region hedging their positions, it means that the situation will get even more confusing in the next 10 to 20 years. So I'm sorry if I've added to your confusion. But with that, why don't I pause here and respond to your questions? Thank you very much.
Can you hear me now? Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kishore, for that very illuminating speech. Perhaps can I start off by asking you a question? Perhaps underlying the conflicts between the United States and China are the fundamental differences between Eastern and Western ways of thinking. You've written extensively, I understand about that. And if I may, I hope I summarize your view correctly. In gist, I believe what you have said or what you have written is that the Western mind is used to black and white distinctions. The Chinese mind is that both black and white can be right. Is it possible at all to reconcile the two sets of thinking?
Well, I think, thank you for that question. I do think there are some differences in the way that the Eastern mind and the Western mind works. But I must emphasize that even though I studied philosophy, actually I studied mostly Western philosophy rather than Eastern philosophy, it's very, very difficult to summarize the differences between the Eastern mind and the Western mind. There are quite, there are similarities and there are differences. But certainly the Western mind is used to black and white perspectives, right or wrong. And for the Western mind, it's very difficult to compromise and accept different realities. And so among most Asian countries, even though they are have clearly a lot of concerns about the rise of China. And since China has become so big and powerful over the last 30 to 40 years, many of the neighbors must worry about how do we deal with this China. But at the same time, they are able to both cooperate and compete with China. And I give one good example, okay? For the United States, the choice is always either we compete or we cooperate, but for many countries in this region, you have to do both. And I give one example, Vietnam. The one country that is the most concerned about China's rise in Southeast Asia clearly is Vietnam, because Vietnam has a 2,000-year history with China. It was occupied by China for 1,000 years. And so the Vietnamese have learned how to deal with China. And so the Vietnamese have a saying that to become a good leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up to China, but you must also be able to get along with China. So this is the contradiction, right? Stand up to China, get along with China. But you therefore have to contain two opposite truths. And so this is what, in my last chapter of my book, I explained the wisdom of the yin and yang philosophy. So you can have contradictions and work with each other, even though you have contradictory points of view. And I discussed that in the last chapter of my book. And I hope that at some point in time, the Western minds will pay more attention to how Asians view things. So let me give you a concrete illustration of yin and yang, okay? In the West, they only speak of human rights. And they believe that rights are the only thing. That's the most important thing is human rights. But in most Asian societies, they say, yes, we must support human rights, but you must also have human responsibilities. So for every right, there should be a responsibility, yin and yang. But you try and put the two together, the West objects. And I know this at first hand because I've said this before. When I was ambassador to the UN in 1998, we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's wonderful. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a beautiful document, a wonderful document. It was good that we're celebrating it. But around that time, it was actually, ironically, a Western statesman, Helmut Schmidt, the former Chancellor of Germany, who proposed, together with a group of other leaders, retired world leaders, that why don't we have, in addition to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, have a Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities? And that would have been a wonderful outcome, right? Rights and responsibilities. But ironically, it was the Western countries who suppressed the document on Universal Declaration of Human Responsibilities, and they didn't even allow for it to be discussed in the UN. They refused to have it discussed. They suppressed it. And I think now when we look at COVID-19, you can see that the West made a huge difference, a huge mistake in emphasizing rights without responsibilities, because if you want to deal with COVID-19, you mustn't just focus on your rights, you must also focus on your responsibilities. So for example, like wearing a mask, many people in the West say, why should I wear a mask? It is constraining my freedom. Yes, it is constraining your freedom, but you also have a responsibility to protect people around you, and that's why you should wear a mask. You shouldn't focus on your rights, you should focus on your responsibility. In most Asian states, frankly, they say accept the fact that they have responsibilities to society, and that frankly is a strength of Chinese society, strength of Confucian society, that they believe in responsibilities are as important as rights. But in the West, they find it very difficult to combine the two, whereas in Asia, we can combine the two. So these are the examples of how the Eastern mind and the Western mind are different.
Thank you very much, Professor. There's a specific question we asked from a listener called Joanne. He said, how important does technology play in the US-China geopolitical tension? We talk about the US-China tech war, reference made by a listener to Huawei, Trump's executive order on TikTok, WeChat, which are all the technological groups. I'm reading from the screen now. What are your views, Professor?
Well, certainly technology will be a major factor in the US-China geopolitical contest. And actually, I do discuss it in my book too. And the general assumption that the United States has is that in the field of technology, United States will always be ahead of China, because United States is an open, free, creative society, and China is an oppressive, dictatorial society. But of course, China has demonstrated very clearly over the last 10 to 20 years that in many areas, its technology is now as good as, if not superior to American technology. It is behind in some areas, in semiconductor chips, for example. It will take some time for China to catch up in semiconductor chips. But if the United States thinks that it can stop China from acquiring the best technology in the world, I think it'll be making a huge mistake, because China has shown clearly that whatever the United States is doing well today, China can replicate and do well tomorrow. And of course, the most stunning example of this is the Chinese mission to Mars and how it was accomplished. That takes the best of science in the world to accomplish that. And China has demonstrated it can do that. Now, so what I'm giving you, therefore, is that the United States should be rational and sensible and acknowledge that it cannot stop China's emergence as a major science and technology power. But having said that, I can also tell you that the United States will try very hard over the next 10 years to deprive China of as much technology as possible to ensure that in an effort to block China from becoming the #1 economy in the world. And since there's a bipartisan consensus in the United States, many of these actions will emerge in the form of legislation passed in the US Congress. And the US Congress, by the way, is very much a major part of the problem in US-China relations, because US congressmen and senators surprisingly are not very thoughtful people. They're not long-term strategic thinkers. They respond to the mood of the day. So they will happily pass legislation against China on technology, not thinking through the consequences of all this, because there's a big danger. There's a theme that I haven't spoken about, that if the United States tries to cut itself off from China, the danger is that the United States will not just be cutting itself off from China, the United States will be cutting itself off from East Asia. And the reason I say this is that the Chinese economy today is deeply integrated with the East Asian economy and will become even more deeply integrated after the regional comprehensive economic partnership is signed, is implemented, sorry, it's signed. So when that happens and a dynamic East Asian economic ecosystem develops, if China tries to cut itself, if the United States tries to cut itself off from China, it won't be just cutting itself off from China, it'll be cutting itself off from a larger region. And that's why I think, my goal actually is to help the United States work out a more thoughtful, a more reflective, careful long-term strategy for cutting off, for dealing with China. Because I find that most Americans have stopped thinking long-term and thinking strategically on how to manage China, and therefore have ended up shooting themselves in the foot. Like, for example, trying to restrict the export of technology to China, it hasn't helped American interests.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor, there is a question from Tan Kong Yan, and I'm reading now from the screen. Professor Kishore, considering the Sino-American geopolitical context, India arguably is the most important independent actor in Asia. But Modi, the Prime Minister, had chosen to align with USA by joining the Quad, escalating the border tension and banning Chinese companies like TikTok in India. My questions are, how strategically important for China to win over India in this context? What would be your advice to Beijing in handling the bilateral relationship with New Delhi going forward? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, India is going to play a very important role. If I'm going to give a good nuanced answer to this question, I only need 1 hour. Because the relations within China and India go back a long time. And it's a very, very complicated relationship. So I can tell you, for example, I said at the beginning, when I was talking about the structural contradictions, the geopolitical contest is always within the #1 power, which today is United States, and #2 power, which today is China. That's in 2021. But 30 years from now, the #1 power in the world will be China, #2 will be India. So the United States will be #3. So in 30 years from now, we will see a major contest maybe developing within China and India. But you've already seen some elements of it recently. I think by and large, I don't think it's fair to say that Prime Minister Modi of India has aligned himself with the United States against China. I don't think he has done that. Actually, India still believes that India will have far greater influence if it's a strategically autonomous actor, an independent actor, and not an ally of the United States. In fact, no Indian government official has ever said categorically that India is an ally of the United States. But of course, at the same time, there's no question that a major accident developed. It was an accident developed in India-China relations over the border incident in June 2020. And we don't know the full story, but clearly Indian and Chinese soldiers confronted themselves at a very high level in very dangerous places, and ended up in a fist fight. And when you have a fist fight at a very high levels, you end up with lots of people dying. And so that created a huge backlash against China and India. And it's true that there's a lot of anti-China sentiment in the Indian body politic. And in response to this anti-China sentiment, Prime Minister Modi had to be seen to stand up to China, and that's how they banned various Chinese apps and so on and so forth. But even today, if I'm not mistaken, you can double check, Google and double check this, India still does more trade with China than it does with the United States of America. And during President Donald Trump's time, even though he declared his great friendship for India, he carried out actions that actually hurt India, like canceling the H-1B visas for Indians to come and work in the United States. So I think India knows very well that the United States is not going to sacrifice American interests to support India, even though the United States will be very happy to see a major conflict break out between China and India. So I think we are still very much in a transitional phase in the Sino-Indian relations. We have to let time pass. We have to let people forget the memories of the June 2020 incident. And then possibly you might find India playing a role where it has good friends of the United States and also good friends of China in other areas. So I can see India playing a useful role in the middle between the United States and China, but it won't happen soon. It will take some time for that to happen.
Thank you, Professor. There's another question from Dr. Cheng, who is the founder of Cheng, and his question is, much of the Western media, including The Economist and the New York Times, have been quite unfriendly to China. What explains this, and what can China do to improve media coverage?
Well, I mean, the Western media proclaims that it is independent, it is objective, it is unbiased, it is neutral. I can go on. Lots of adjectives to describe especially the Anglo-Saxon media. But there's no question in my mind that the Anglo-Saxon media has sort of inherited the anti-China bias that has developed in the Western mind and has basically focused only on writing negative stories of China. So if the Anglo-Saxon media, and I would say the European media sometimes is a bit fairer, by the way. The Germans are not as ideological as the Anglo-Saxon media is. If you read the Anglo-Saxon media and you make the Anglo-Saxon media, like the New York Times, the primary source of information on China, you will get a distorted impression of China. And I'll give you one example of the distorted impression of China. Because the New York Times will always emphasize the fact that China is run by an undemocratic government. It is true. China's government is not elected by the people of China, therefore it is undemocratic. And then they sort of imply that because it is undemocratic, the Chinese government survives in office only by pushing down the Chinese people, by oppressing the Chinese people. And most Americans believe that the Chinese government is oppressive and suppressing the rights of the Chinese people. That's what they believe. So what is the reality? The reality is what the Harvard Kennedy School study came out with, which is that if in the year 2003, 86% of Chinese people supported the government in China, by 2016, it had increased to 93%. Now, the US government doesn't enjoy 93% support from the American people, but the Chinese government does. And there's a good reason for that, because in the last 40 years, the Chinese people have seen greater improvement in their living conditions than they have seen in the past 4,000 years. So when the Americans keep asking the Chinese people, why don't you overthrow the Chinese Communist Party? It is oppressing you. The Chinese people are very puzzled. Why should we overthrow the Chinese Communist Party? We have seen greater improvement in our lives under the Communist Party of China. And by the way, before we had the Communist Party of China, the West was trampling all over China. When China was weak, the West didn't care about human rights in China. It was only when China became strong that the West became concerned about human rights in China. So you can see how, it's quite amazing that in theory, the New York Times is supposed to give you a fair and balanced view of the world. And in many areas it does, to be fair, okay? To be fair, it does that. But when it comes to China, there's no doubt whatsoever in my mind that the ideological lenses that are worn by Anglo-Saxon reporters especially prevents them from understanding China, which is why, by the way, you mentioned earlier, Cheng Huan, that many people in the West are also reading me. I think many people in the West are also beginning to understand that they cannot trust their own media when it comes to understanding China, because it is not fair and not objective. And for me, the advantage I have is that I'm neither a Westerner, nor am I Chinese. In fact, I don't even speak or read Chinese. And I try to be independent and objective in my analysis of what's happening in China. And to me, it's quite a shock that there is actually not a single Anglo-Saxon newspaper or journal that can, in a sense, try to be objective when it comes to China, and certainly be objective on US-China relations. But I do believe, by the way, that this is where I also blame Asians for this, because at the end of the day, only 12% of the world's population lives in the West, 12%. Almost 50% live in Asia. Why are we Asians so quiet? Why don't we write letters? Why don't we send the West 4 billion letters saying, hey, you misunderstand what's happening in Asia. You misunderstand what's happening in China. I think we Asians, partly because of our culture, we are often told don't disagree publicly, right? It's not polite to disagree publicly. But when it comes to dealing with the West, it's a mistake not to disagree publicly, because then they have the wrong impression of you. So it's very, very important, therefore, and one reason why I keep on speaking and speaking to groups like yours, Cheng Huan, is that I want Asians to directly respond to a lot of spurious Western reporting on China, because then they will not understand the real strong China that is emerging.
Thank you. There's another question, slightly a bit different. How do you see the future of a US dollar with the coming of the digital renminbi? as digital renminbi allows anyone with a mobile phone to hold renminbi. With US continuing to print dollars, renminbi is not a bad option, considering that many other things only use renminbi to buy from China. What are your comments?
Well, I do discuss the role of the US dollar in my book as China Won. But I must emphasize, again, I'm not an expert in this field. But I think when future historians look back at our time, I actually warned the United States that it's very unwise for the United States to weaponize the US dollar. Why is it unwise for the United States to weaponize the US dollar? It's unwise because when the US dollar is the global reserve currency, the United States enjoys something which a former French president calls an exorbitant privilege. What is an exorbitant privilege? Let me explain it simply. When the Chinese work for 10 hours a day, putting together an iPhone, a very sophisticated product in China, they have to work hours and hours and hours. And then they ship the iPhone to the United States. And all that the United States has to do to pay for that iPhone is to print money. So if you can print money and it's accepted by the rest of the world as the global reserve currency, you can live beyond your means. Now, what happens if the world stops accepting the US dollar as the global reserve currency, which I fear will happen someday? And the reason why it'll happen, again, history tells us, okay? You know, in the 19th century, when the British Empire was number one, it was a pound sterling. That was the global reserve currency. And then when America became the number one economy, the US dollar became the global reserve currency. So logically, when China becomes number one, the renminbi will become the global reserve currency, but not soon. No time soon at all, because China still doesn't have, as you know, an open capital account, and so it won't happen that soon. But at the same time, the one issue which I raised in my book as China Won, I point out that the main reason why we use the US dollar in international trade is that you have a common unit of value to measure relative value. So when Argentina exports beef to China, right, it gets back US dollars. And when China exports manufactured products to Argentina, it gets back US dollars. But the US dollar plays a critical role as a unit of value to assess how many tons of beef for how many machines from China. But this today can be done by advanced blockchain technology. So at some point in time, I don't know when, it is conceivable that countries will just stop using the US dollar as a unit of value for international trade. I don't know when it's going to happen. But when that happens, and when the US dollar is no longer used as a global reserve currency, then the standard of living of the American people will drop significantly. And so, therefore, it's in the interest of the United States to actually encourage the world to continue using the US dollar. And here I'm speaking as a friend of the United States. I'm saying this as a friend of the United States, you should be encouraging people to use the US dollar rather than discouraging people to use the US dollar. But as you know, the United States has used its position as the custodian, the global reserve currency, to punish even European companies, European banks, you know. And I don't know how much the BNP paid, $6 billion or $9 billion fine to the US government for carrying out trade with Iran. And that's an example of weaponizing the US dollar. And the more that the United States weaponizes the US dollar, the more it creates the incentives for countries to walk away from the US dollar. The more that countries walk away from the US dollar, the dollar's role in the global reserve currency will diminish. And then, sadly, the livelihood of the American people will also suffer. And so as a friend of the American people, I'm saying, why are you damaging your own livelihood by weaponizing the US dollar? This is unwise.
Thank you, Professor. It's a more direct question related to Hong Kong. Um, Someone asked, since most countries have a national security law, including Malaysia and Singapore, why is it that Western countries have adopted a double standard in their approach to the Hong Kong national security law? Has the Hong Kong national security law improved the political situation here?
Well, I'm glad that that question was raised because it illustrates a point. I began by saying that I began my talk by saying that the world has to deal with three structural changes. First is the end of the era of Western domination of world history. And notice how I put Hong Kong firmly in the era of Western domination of world history, and then to deal with a geopolitical contest within US and China. So Hong Kong has become a useful propaganda weapon that the West can use against China. So I want to emphasize one thing. For those of you watching in Hong Kong, please don't believe that the West loves the people of Hong Kong. Please don't believe that. Hong Kong is just a very useful political tool that they can use to embarrass China. That's all they want to do. They want to use the Hong Kong people as a propaganda weapon against China. But the day when it no longer suits Western interests to do so, they will completely forget about you, right? So, I mean, as you know, the United States spent $1 trillion trying to defend, trying to fight in Afghanistan, then got tired of it, and now United States is withdrawing from Afghanistan. So it's just like he will use Afghanistan to fight others and then drop Afghanistan. So he will use Hong Kong as a propaganda weapon and then drop Hong Kong at some point in time. So it's very important for the people of Hong Kong to understand that they're being used as a propaganda weapon and not that they care for what the people of Hong Kong are doing like. But on the specific question of national security law, I think it's important to emphasize that the provision for a national security law was, I believe, contained in the basic law. Cheng, you can confirm that as part of the understandings that were reached between UK and China. Unwisely, some people in Hong Kong blocked the passage of a national security law in Hong Kong. And, national security is one thing that most countries don't compromise on. And as long as Hong Kong is part of China, and if Hong Kong's defense and foreign affairs is defended by China, it's quite natural for China to say, I want to see national security laws that will not endanger the rest of China. So in a sense, I think the concern that the Americans or Westerners are showing for Hong Kong is in some ways, to put it very bluntly, very hypocritical. And I say hypocritical because when Hong Kong was a colony of the British, no one ever said at that point in time, United States Congress didn't say at that point in time, why can't the Hong Kong people vote for their own government? Why didn't they say that when it was a British colony, right? So, I mean, this is an example of hypocrisy. And if for any reason, by the way, and I want to emphasize this, if tomorrow for some reason, United States and China have to cooperate on something more fundamental, then Hong Kong will be dropped completely. This is as a student of geopolitics for 50 years, I've seen how countries are used for propaganda and then dropped for propaganda, or territories are used, like territories like Hong Kong are used for propaganda and then dropped. So Hong Kong should not feel that anybody in the West is going to come and defend Hong Kong. That will never happen. And so the people of Hong Kong should understand the geopolitical realities and make sure that they don't get trampled on in this contest between US and China.
Thank you very much, Professor. There are a number of questions touching on India, but basically perhaps more important question is, in your opinion, will India ever likely to be a major power, and when?
I actually, in the medium term and long term, very optimistic for the future of India. And I mean, I try to be objective, even though I'm ethnically Indian. Because, you know, if you look at the most competitive human laboratory in the world is the United States of America. And as you know, the best brains from all over the world, from Argentina, Brazil, Angola, India, China, Japan, South Korea, have all gone to the United States to compete in the most competitive human laboratory in the world, which is the United States of America. So that's a level playing field. And you know which ethnic group has performed the best in the most competitive human laboratory in the world? Is the ethnic Indian group. And in fact, the per capita income of the average Indian family in the United States of America is higher than that of the Japanese or the Jewish families or the Korean families and so on and so forth. So that is a powerful indicator of how dynamic the Indians can be. And so that's, and if you look, for example, you know, the largest corporations in the United States of America, Google, is run by someone born in India, Sundar Pichai. Microsoft is run by someone born in India, Satya Nadella. So you can see that the Indians have tremendous potential. The only problem is that Indians are very successful outside India, but not successful inside India. And the reason for that, and this is a controversial point I'm making here, let me emphasize, is that Indians are very good at competition, but India doesn't allow competition. India has still a very protectionist economy. And you know, when India protects the Indian economy, it thinks it's protecting the Indian people. Actually, it is disabling the Indian people because it is not giving them the competition that they are good at doing it. So therefore, when India decided not to join the regional comprehensive economic partnership, even though many of the RCEP countries wanted India to join, we waited 5 years for India to join. In the end, India decided not to join, and by not joining, India made a major strategic mistake, not just in geopolitics, because then it basically let China be the dominant economic player in East Asia. But the other bigger economic mistake it made is that it didn't give a chance for the Indian economy to succeed and thrive with more competition. And the one lesson that India should learn directly from China is that the reason why China succeeded is because it opened up its economy to the world. And in fact, I was in Davos in January 2017 when President Xi Jinping gave a speech. And there's one paragraph in that speech which I think every Indian should pay attention to, which is that when China plunged into the ocean of globalization, as President Xi said, he said, China struggled to swim. We drank water. We had a very hard time. By the end of the day, we became strong swimmers. And today, China can compete with any country in the world. So in the same way, we know that Indians can compete anywhere in the world. And so the Indian government should overcome the vested interests in India. And the vested interest in India, of course, the industries that are lazy and don't want to compete with the rest of the world. They're happy to have India as an exclusive oligopolistic market. And therefore, the choice that the Indian leaders have is, do they want to put the interests of the Indian industries first, or the Indian people first? Because the Indian people will be much better off if there's more competition inside India and between India and the rest of the world. Because frankly, India is afraid that if it opens up to the rest of the world, the Indian economy would suffer. Actually, the rest of the world should worry, because if the Indian economy opens up, Indians will succeed as well as they have in the United States, and India will become the #1 economy in the world.
Thank you, Professor. Time is running short. Perhaps I'll ask the last question, if I may. If United States and China are #1, #2 powers in the world, is India likely to be the potential #3, or which country will be the potential #3 power?
Well, there's no question that within 10 to 15 years, the top three powers will be China, United States, and India, very clearly. But I think Europe will still be a major actor in the world, and to some extent, Russia, but not very big because its economy is not very big. But it will be a multipolar world. It will also be, by the way, again, going back to my very first, I want to go back to my first three structural challenges. There are lots of changes happening around the world. So, for example, we haven't talked about Africa, right? Africa's population is exploding, and Africa's role, you look at one, I give one statistic. In the year 1950, Europe's population was double that of Africa's. Today, Africa's population is more than double that of Europe. By 2100, Africa's population will be 10 times the size of Europe. So you can see how Europe's influence will shrink in the world, relatively speaking, unless it's able to reinvent itself and do something. And I've given lots of advice to Europeans on how they can reinvent themselves. So it's not a simple case of 1, 2, or 3 powers. It's a case where a majority of the world's population that has been relatively passive in the last 200 years of Western domination of world history are now waking up. And so it is not, if you want to understand the world of tomorrow, don't just focus on 1, 2, or 3 countries. Look at different regions and how they will play a role. And so, for example, I can tell you that, no one pays much attention to ASEAN, but let me give you one statistic about ASEAN. Everyone looks at Japan as a great economic power. In the year 2000, Japan's economy was 8 times the size of ASEAN. 2000. By 2020, it was only 1.6 times larger. By 2030, ASEAN's economy will be bigger than Japan. So, that's an example of how profoundly the world is shifting in our time. So we live in a time of amazing change. Amazing. No other period of human history has experienced as much change as we are experiencing. No other period of human history had to deal with 3 structural challenges at the same time, but ours has to do so. And therefore, I would say, don't just focus on 1, 2, 3 countries. Look at the whole world, look at the bigger picture, and try to understand how the different parts fit together in a very complex new global order that is emerging.
Thank you, Professor. I've been pressed to ask you one really last question. Will India likely to join ASEAN? There's a regional partnership. We are aware, of course.
I think if India wanted to do what is the best thing in the long run for the Indian economy, it should join the RCEP, because the RCEP countries bent over backwards to accommodate Indian interests and concerns. But if the Indian government wants to have a short-term protectionist policies, then it will not join the RCEP. So I think it's very important for the Indians who are outside India to actually advise the Indian government to say, if you really want to make India a great power, if you really want to make India a competitive global economy, the first thing that India should do is to join the RCEP. But I think unless more voices speak out from outside India, then unfortunately, India will go backwards. And what do I mean by going backwards? I gave you just now the comparison between Japan and ASEAN. In the year 1980, China's economy and India's economy was the same size. Today, China's economy is 5 times the size of India and will become even larger unless India joins the RCEP. I think that's the main reason why India should join, but I'm not optimistic that it will join soon.
Thank you very much, Professor Kishore. I must apologize for my inability to ask many questions. There are many questions still unanswered from listeners from different parts of the world, but time is up. And I think I have to end here. And if I may end by saying that on behalf of May Cheng and Sing Cheng, we wish to thank you very much indeed for giving up your very valuable time, Professor Kishore, to speak to us. I think we've always learned a lot and very grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. See you in Hong Kong someday, I hope. Bye-bye.
See you in Hong Kong is a day, Professor.
Yeah. See you in Hong Kong.
Yes, we look forward to that. And you have to sign my book, okay?
Yeah, I'll sign your book. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.